Looking around this room, I see so many familiar faces. Curious, how many of you have the experience when you come to a Synergy of like a family reunion or a high school reunion or something each year? Show of hands? Yeah? Yeah, I'm absolutely with you there. I like hate to admit it, but I was doing the math. This is the 21st Synergy that I've been at and presented at. It's ridiculous to think about that. Although I'll tell you at this point, I'm feeling every one of those years with this whole, so the short version on this, because I've had to answer the question once or twice, rotator cuff surgery 4 weeks ago, snowboarding accident. Yes, it hurts like hell, but I'm recovering. Anyway, my name is Rick Dellinger. I'm a solution architect on the strategic alliances team with Citrix. And I'm actually, speaking of guys who've been around the industry a little while, I'm fortunate enough to be joined on the stage by Mr. Andrew Kloman. Andrew, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yep. Hey, everyone. I'm Andrew Kloman. I'm a partner solutions architect at AWS. I'm also the global technology lead for end user computing partners. Also worked at Citrix off and on back since 2008. Been doing Citrix stuff about 15 some odd years. So, yeah.
It's possible we actually ended up working together at one of our past stops in life. Anyway, thank everybody for joining us this morning. Hopefully you've been enjoying the conference so far. We hope to extend that enjoyment and give you a little bit more value today as we talk through and give you kind of the latest skinny on Citrix on AWS. AWS? You got a new acronym to play with now. Congratulations. So here's kind of the flow that we plan on going through today. We're going to start off with a little bit of an introduction. Then we're going to dig into the different AWS services that are leveraged underneath the Citrix stack. Talk about a couple of interesting things that have happened here recently. Put that stuff into context for you.
Very recently.
Then we're going to dive in and start talking about some of the different deployment options available if you're interested in running, in particular, an app and desktop workload on top of AWS. And we're going to step into and dig into some of the resources that are available for anybody that's looking to go down this road. We're going to touch on some of the most common obstacles that people bump into, the workarounds. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the new stuff, some of the recent announcements that have come out of AWS and have come out of Citrix, some of the joint innovation that we've done. We'll talk about some of the things that are coming up. We'll loop back around, do a quick summary and wrap up. Knowing us, we probably are not going to end up with time for Q&A,
right? But
we will certainly try, and if not, we're going to do the hang around outside afterwards thing. So feel free to hit us up with any questions that you've got. So with that, would you like to kick us off, sir?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
All right. So why Citrix on AWS? Citrix and AWS has had a pretty long relationship as well, right? So support with Citrix on AWS back since 6.5. Machine creation services, somewhere around 2014, started integrating with AWS, being able to automatically provision out desktops, work with the resources, do all this kind of automation, right? But there's also, Amazon Workspaces. That's another solution that's out there, right? This is a blog article from back when that launched, from Citrix. It really kind of comes down to, this is an important space, right? There's Amazon Workspaces that exist, and Citrix and that exists, and they have their differentiators, right? There's reasons why people would choose one solution over the other. Really, in the same kind of way, Amazon does this a lot, right? Think about Netflix. Think about Amazon Prime Video. I really like Stranger Things, right? The show on Netflix. It's an awesome show. But there's also Miss Maisel, and I just recently watched Fleabag on Amazon Prime Video, which is incredible, right? Maybe in that case, differentiators, right? So in the same kind of way, right, there's differentiators for the Citrix solution on AWS, and getting into those, we see that as Citrix and AWS together within that story for being able to deploy out desktop resources within minutes, not having to provision for peak within your on-premises environment. So much faster deployment cycles. Again, the machine creation services integration with AWS, it's somewhere around 5 years now that we've been working on that together. In the last year, we've done a whole bunch of stuff So a lot smarter capabilities there. Again, trusted, right? The maturity of the solutions. Citrix has been around for a really long time. AWS has been the player that's been around for the longest in this space. And then with the global infrastructure from AWS, all the regions and availability zones that we have, and then with Citrix Cloud, all the capabilities that it has in its global footprint. So differentiators, main point of context there, and the differentiators that we see here. So diving into AWS a little bit further, we'll look into some of the features and services that are available from AWS. So how many people in the room are familiar with AWS? Just kind of get a scope here. That's actually a pretty good number. I'd probably say that's more than half. OK. So a lot of people don't know it at all, and people are very, very focused in it. Some people may know about Amazon EC2, Elastic Cloud Compute. That's kind of where you get your compute instances from, storage, and so on. VPC from the networking side. Direct Connect, being able to connect on premises to your AWS region into your on-premises facilities. A whole list of different services, right? We have 125 different services out there. That's a lot, right? So asked how many people know about AWS. How many people are familiar or do things like communicate with satellites and do downstream control of satellites, data communications? How many in the room do satellite-based kind of things? Maybe one or two? OK, so super small percentage, right? We have services that focus on those kind of things, right? So it goes from your Elastic Cloud Compute infrastructure there, all the way to very particular services that are going to be super niche market, right? At least in this world, right? You can go to another conference and then the whole group would be focused on that. So 125 services. I think from this crowd's perspective, the things that are listed here in big blocks are the things that you should probably get more focused on and get more familiarity with. So we do have digital training. We have classroom trainings. AWS summits, they're all over the globe. They're probably in your city. Go check those out. They're a lot of, fun, but there's also a lot of education to be had in them, and they're free. AWS certifications, I just got my AWS Solutions Architect Pro. It's extremely hard, but go out there, at least get the associates, check that out. Again, anyone could be, from the initial part of getting familiar with AWS all the way into very niche pieces there.
So I'm noticing an interesting box off to the right of the screen there, Mr. The whole VMware Cloud on AWS. Seems a little bit odd to be talking about a VMware technology in a Citrix and AWS session.
Yeah.
I'm curious, how many of you have been thinking about VMware Cloud on AWS? Right? I see a few hands go up. Yeah, so there's been an interesting evolution in the marketplace. And they've obviously been working on this service, and it's been jamming its way along. And here, relatively recently, an interesting thing happened. So there was a blog post that came out back, about the the November-ish time frame. God, the months have completely melded into each other.
Blurred.
So a good friend of mine, also been in the industry for about a bazillion years, ended up spending some time working with and actually went through and did a Citrix Ready verification for this stuff. And it's pretty interesting. I'm curious from your perspective, because you've touched some of these as well, right? What are people interested in about it? What's compelling about that solution to them? Can you give us a little more insight?
Yeah, so the VMware Cloud on AWS solution, it is, AWS is providing bare metal instances to VMware. VMware takes that and then deploys their stack on top of that. So NSX, vCenter, vSAN, that whole environment, right? Deploys out SDDCs and then gives that to our customers. So it is a jointly engineered solution. This is something where, from a networking perspective and a storage perspective, there's a lot of things that we've both built together for this solution. But it is a solution that's sold, delivered, supported by VMware. From our perspective, we're providing this infrastructure, and from a sales perspective, an operations perspective, that's coming from VMware. But because of its capability, layer 2 networking is a big piece. You could provide provisioning services within this environment. You can use the same image on premises and into AWS in this case. So for hybrid cloud environments, it makes a lot of sense. For environments where you want to be able to use the same tool stack on premises as well as within AWS, that burst to the cloud or hybrid cloud or just having the same tool sets are major pieces of why you'd want to use VMware Cloud on AWS.
That's interesting stuff. And what was also really interesting is once we had posted this, so from the Citrix perspective, we're not necessarily involved in those decisions when a customer is looking at a VMware technology. As most people see Citrix and VMware as these massive competitors in the marketplace. And yeah, granted, there's some battles, and occasionally the companies will step up and act like 2-year-olds and throw darts at each other in the media and stuff. So things can get a little bit ridiculous on occasion. But what was interesting is once this article came out, we started to get a much better feel for what kind of interest was there and what kind of demand there would be for that kind of technology from our customers. And in kind of an interesting and I'd say very relevant example of companies doing the right thing and listening to what the customers are asking for, those of you that were at the keynote may have noticed something kind of interesting. So a VMware slide right in the middle of our keynote. Kind of crazy. So the cool thing here, like I said, is that I see this as an instance where two big companies set their egos aside for a little bit and actually did the right thing by the customer, did the right thing by the customers that we had spoken with that are really, really interested in doing this. So Citrix, we announced our intent to offer not Citrix Ready Verified type of support for VMC, but actually Citrix supported support for VMC. All right, so note this is our intent, and I'll tell you, we got a little bit of work to do, right? Because you're talking about two cloud platforms that are moving pretty darn quickly and trying to coordinate the two of those together. But especially given the folks that have been involved in working really hard on this and trying to make this relationship happen, I think we got some pretty exciting stuff to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of with that, with the kind of story where, in this solution, we're getting feedback from customers. We're understanding where people want to go with things. We want to be from an AWS perspective, and I think everyone really wants to be customer obsessed, and we understand where customers want to, in this case, move up the stack with VMware, right? And getting that feedback is really important. Where we see the market going, we want to make sure that we're driving it the right way. With that, the kind of up the stack term that we use at AWS, we like providing more than just the compute, right? We like providing things that are going further up the stack to make it easier for administrators, probably as yourself, and engineers, but also for customers to consume AWS in this case, and I'm sure with Citrix as well. But so moving up the stack, we want to provide more services. We want to provide things where we have AWS directory services, Amazon RDS, or somewhat recently, Amazon FSx. So if you're not familiar with these, we'll start with the AWS directory service. So that is something that we provide as a native Microsoft Active Directory environment. That's something where AWS manages it. So again, moving up the stack where you don't have to manage that Active Directory environment, but it's a fully native solution. So in a managed AWS environment, we stand that up. We do the backups, the monitoring, the patching, all that kind of stuff for you. You don't need someone that does that on a day-to-day basis. What we do provide is a network interface, an elastic network interface that sits inside of your VPC and in your subnets. So you can switch the DNS over. You can have everyone authenticate to the Active Directory machines, completely native, using your remote tools to connect into that. And you just start that as a service. It's a completely automated thing for customers. In the same way with Amazon RDS, same kind of story with Microsoft SQL. That's again an endpoint that sits in your environment, and you can remotely manage that instance. And with FSx, same kind of story too, right? But this is particularly for CIFS file shares. Again, native Microsoft environment there. With that, we went through the Citrix Ready verified process with Citrix on RDS and AWS Directory Service. Haven't quite got to FSX just yet. But we went through that verification process because we saw that customers really saw the benefit in this. Not even just for POCs, being able to spin this up really quickly, but in production as well. From an operations perspective, but even in some cases cost as well.
And from the Citrix perspective, these are just the same types of services that we integrate and leverage for our technologies anyway, right? So we're talking to Active Directory, we're talking to SQL, we're talking to Windows file shares. So in terms of the supportability of the solution, it is the same technology that our customers have been using for years and years. What's different about it? Well, they don't have full administrative control of the Active Directory.
Sure.
Okay, so there are a couple things you got to pay attention to there. Same thing with the SQL environment of the file servers. But you still use all the same native tools and everything.
Right. You don't RDP
to
into
manage
the desktop, but
they still function the same.
Yep.
And the beautiful part of that is that, again, the more type of complete managed services that you can consume as an organization, the more value you can potentially get back out of leveraging cloud services, right? Because those things are managed and maintained for you, allowing you to focus on the things that are important to your business.
Yep, exactly. So, go into some of the deployment options and resources available for this.
Yes. So there's obviously a couple different ways that you can go about deploying Citrix virtual apps and desktops on top of AWS, right? Because we have the two different mechanisms. You can either deploy and leverage Citrix Cloud virtual app and desktop service for your brokering, or you could leverage the traditional, the on-prem, or what I've taken to calling customer managed model, right? Because when you deploy an LTSR or a CR up on AWS, yeah, it's up there in the cloud, but it's still you or a partner of yours that's doing the management for you. So we tried to break down and just do some high-level guidance on which one of the options might make most sense for customers here. And now, mind you, these lists are absolutely not exhaustive, and there's plenty of room for cross-pollination, if you will, between the two. But in general, if you're taking a look at virtual apps and desktops, you want to take a look at it for the types of use cases where the managed service simplicity is something that's of value to you. Also, when you're consuming virtual apps and desktops as a service, you're also getting the continuous innovation, right? And for some organizations and some environments, that continuous innovation, that constant change and just automatically getting new features and capabilities is a very positive thing. Also, when you start moving workloads into the cloud and you start consuming services from the cloud, kind of one of the tenets of cloud is that you design things for failure, right? Technology is not infallible. Technology will fail, as all of us that are technologists in this world know. So it's important that you design services that you deliver so they can be accommodative. Do I get a vocab point for that? Please?
I don't even know.
Anybody? You guys are harsh. So it's important that your workloads can handle a little bit of failure, and that's what a lot of the services that are delivered from the cloud are built that way, right? And then the last one I'll point out here is a kind of a guiding point, is if you're looking for built-in cost management and capacity control. And I'm going to come back and touch on that here in a little bit. But then obviously we still support, and we have a lot of customers that are running a self-managed type of an environment. So they're either deploying our LTSR or our cumulative release. So this is a great solution for environments where you've got some very extensive integration or customization requirements for the environment. There's also, if you've got use cases that have very customized, very, very special type of user requirements, it works good there. Also, we do occasionally bump into environments where the customer doesn't have an option but to do like a lift and shift type of a scenario, move things over. Now I'll tell you, as a technologist who's constantly out at the front and seeing and feeling and even in some cases helping create the next waves of innovation, it kind of pains me a little bit to see people take the old stuff and just take the old stuff as it is and move it up. But there are cases where that does make sense for some customers and their environments. But one of the bigger things that we keep hearing from customers, and their reasons why they want to hold on to these older types of versions, is the whole control aspect, right? So we're as technologists, we're built on control. Like we like to be able to touch and hold, and we like to be able to take that call when that 911 call comes in. We like to be able to be the hero and answer. So in those types of scenarios, you do give up a little bit of a measure of control. And for some people, when you got to give up a little bit of control over some of the services you deliver, that causes some anxiety, both social anxiety, personal anxiety, organizational anxiety. And then finally, for organizations that have the expertise and the tooling to be able to do their own cost management and capacity management. Let me touch on this one a little bit more. So you may have caught here recently, we've got an Autoscale feature set now that is available. The Autoscale feature set is a feature set that comes out of the Citrix Cloud delivered services. It takes the old service that we used to have in place. We have the SmartScale service that we've been running for a long time, hadn't seen a lot of attention. That's actually going end of life here pretty, well, in a few days, another week or so? The beautiful thing with the Autoscale service is it actually really amps things up substantially over some of the older tooling, more brittle tooling that we had in place. So it gives us some additional reporting and visibility in Director, so you can actually go and get a feel for exactly what's going on, what type of things the service is doing. And it also supports things like bursting and some DR and HA types of scenarios. So it's a pretty cool, pretty powerful feature. But this feature is a feature and component of Citrix Cloud. And it's really the combination of all the cloud services and the way we're able to bring those together that allows us to deliver this. So that's why it's available there. All right, so now let's step in and start talking a little bit about some of the automation technologies and stuff. So one thing you're going to hear now, and to consider when you start talking about working with public cloud and working with cloud services, is you got to start thinking a little bit differently. Right? When you're dealing with services and you're dealing with APIs, it gives you the opportunity to start managing your infrastructure as code. And we're finding a lot of organizations where we kind of push that direction, but really haven't gone over that line too awfully far. But it's a fantastic thing once you wrap your mind around it and get a feel for what you can do with it. You can actually take and deploy pretty darn complex services with the click of a button. The other thing that's beautiful about that is that as you're deploying and reproducing those services, you can pretty easily customize them and modify them.
Yep.
And so in the AWS world, Amazon has this cool infrastructure called CloudFormation that we can leverage.
Exactly.
Right? So we did some pretty cool stuff with CloudFormation, right?
Exactly, yep. So as the building blocks go to building out this quick start, we use CloudFormation to initiate the VPC build-out, so the networking components within 2 availability zones, all the subnets, all that kind of thing, to deploy out a NAT gateway, to deploy out the EC2 instances to have Bastion hosts, even deploy out the AWS Active Directory components to that. So CloudFormation being able to deploy out all the AWS components, right? Another cool thing about CloudFormation is that you can add in additional scripting on top of that. So like with the quick start here, we do things where we have the SDKs and the PowerShell scripts to automate the deployment of Citrix resource locations on AWS. So initially, we install the components on the cloud connectors, all the prerequisites behind that, I mean .NET or whatever it may be, and go and then tell the machine to install the cloud connectors and set up a resource location on Citrix Cloud. Basically, at the end of all of this, you're able to go into Citrix Workspace and click on the VDA that's launched within this environment and get that desktop resource.
Just log in automatically.
Yeah, you don't really need to know, frankly, much about AWS. You frankly don't need to know much about Citrix. You run this quick start, end result, you get a desktop. It's pretty cool. Pretty cool way of getting a desktop really easily.
And all you need to do to get started with it, you just need an AWS subscription.
Yep.
And you need a Citrix Cloud App and Desktop subscription or trial.
Exactly.
Right?
Super easy.
Yeah, so the other thing about the quick starts, and the thing that's a little bit different in as you kind of adjust your thinking a little bit, when you've got infrastructure as code and you can deploy those things as code, you can reproduce things like best practices and reference architectures. So in the past, you've heard us talk quite a bit about reference architectures. You know, people are always asking, oh, I want a reference architecture for this. I want a reference architecture for that. And that's actually, we're doing a lot of that. In fact, my team inside of Citrix is kind of at the front edge of a charge to really build out our reference architecture and some of our deeper technical training material. But when you start talking about working with cloud services, if you go to someone whose life has lived in the cloud from day one, they don't have some of this historical experience and perspectives that a lot of us that have been around for a while bring to the table, they start talking about design patterns, right? So what you get, and this is pretty darn cool because you don't really have to know all the intricacies of what's inside.
Exactly.
What you get when you get to the end of this is an architecture and a design for a system that matches a best of breed design pattern.
Exactly.
Right?
Yep.
So it's pretty darn cool stuff. You can also leverage this to do the ground up, right? I got nothing other than empty subscriptions and services, and I would just want to stand something up so I can learn, or so I can reverse engineer. It's actually a fantastic way to learn. If you have an opportunity to go in and touch and play with and dig around and tear apart a system that's already been built, that's a great way, actually, by reverse engineering a system to learn about it. So this has been pretty cool. We got that starting point, and you got another entry point that we can do where if you've already got a VPC in place, if you've already got Active Directory in place, you've already got all the other resources you need, and you want to actually get into a deployment really quickly, you can start essentially partway through, right? Because CloudFormation leverages multiple templates that can be nested and teed amongst each other and share variables between them. So you can leverage the midway starting point or deploy into an existing VPC and Active Directory, as it points out on the site. And you can leverage that even for production deployment. So we actually, a great example of how this stuff can be used semi-creatively was the lab that we delivered here at Synergy. So the labs were a great time, and if you take a look at all we had sought to deliver with this lab, it's pretty darn comprehensive and extensive. So it was really the power in leveraging those quick starts that allowed us to build this lab. And we got some fantastic feedback back out of it. But the super cool thing, from my perspective, I'm kind of excited about as we go into the rest of this year, is we put the energy and effort into the way that we built this lab so it's actually really easy and even cost effective for us to reproduce it. So this was the first time that this lab had been delivered, but now this lab can be reproduced all over the place. So imagine being able to do a really deep, very extensive integration lab like that, scale it up or down to the technical levels of the group that you've got to play, brought to the table to play. And it's going to be a great opportunity for you to learn about the combination of the two technologies and how they interact and the systems that they build. So if you're doing things like user group meetings, or you're wanting to do like a learning event for the engineers in your environment or something like that, this is an option out there. So if you have any interest in doing that, reach out to us, let us know. We'll see what we can do about pulling it together for you. So what about the other folks, right? We get, so for the cloud services consumers, we've got this quick start template. What do we do for the folks wanting to do LTSR?
Yep, for LTSR, we also deployed a deployment guide. So this starts off with, again, CloudFormation templates, but building out that foundational AWS components, right? So VPCs, subnets, all that kind of stuff. But then from there, kind of walks the user through. So this deployment guide has the desktop delivery controller using Amazon RDS, using the AWS directory service, but this is more of a walkthrough, not fully automated. And really that comes down to the complexity that is required to deploy an environment like this. So check out the deployment guide. It's a blog article that we released this past year. But we want to make it easy for people to consume on AWS, and this is another way.
Awesome. So another resource before we transition out of this section I'd like to share is this kind of innovative Accelerate program that Citrix and Amazon have put together. So kind of the goal of this program is to help folks that are looking at evaluating using the combination of the technologies together, or looking for a way to help accelerate their deployment. This program, you get yourself into it, provides access to some of the experts, some of the resources that we've got available, and even potentially some funding and credit funding to be able to pull this stuff off. So again, that's another place. If you're interested in that, reach out, let us know, and we'll work from there. Now, we end up bumping into a lot of customers over the time and the work that we do. And there commonly comes up a pretty common list of challenges, right?
Right. Yeah, so from, again, the customer feedback, right, that we get from customers deploying these. So maybe you're looking at going into a POC, or maybe you have this in production today. These are the things that we found from customer feedback that may be a little bit of a stumbling block, or just really good information to have when you're going through this process. So today, machine creation services, it's just an XML file that lists the EC2 instances that are available. That may get out of date, right? AWS is constantly getting new services and new EC2 instances in this case. Blog article, the tech article there, go into that and find out how to make that change for the new EC2 instances. There was a change on MCS at one point for dedicated instances, basically what the volume worker was using for an EC2 instance. Won't go into the details for that one, but check out that article if you're using dedicated instances. EBS volume hydration. So there's a process of moving from an Amazon machine image into EBS volumes. That can take some time. Check out that script, document there for a way to make that process a little bit better, to hydrate that quicker or before it becomes available within the DDC. Common question, what are the permissions that are needed for machine creation services to talk to AWS? Check out that article there. And then we've also noticed that within an AWS account, you have default VPCs. Some people delete those for a multitude of different reasons. There's an article there. Citrix MCS uses the default VPC for the volume service server worker, one of those words.
Easy for you to say.
To deploy out some resources. So if that's changed, check out that article there.
All right, so I guess we better pick up our pace a little bit, huh?
Yeah, I think we do. Yeah,
tidbits to talk about. All right, so one very important thing that I want to call out, and this is a recurring mistake that we see over and over as customers start to take on this journey. You know, if you're looking to migrate or move some of your workloads out of a data center that you own and manage and maintain, or maybe a partner owns and manages and maintains, and you are looking to move to AWS, one of the biggest stumbling blocks people end up running into is the network. They forget about the network. So I can't tell you how often we run into scenarios where customers all set, they think they got their architecture, they got workloads tested, and then they realize, oh shoot, we didn't pay enough attention to the network, and now we're having problems. So it ends up slowing things down. So now I don't want you to like totally get all anal and try and dig in and figure out every little tidbit of what I'm showing here. But I brought this slide up to make two quick points. One, obviously, don't forget the networking infrastructure. And two, I wanted to call out, you can kind of see it a little bit from the mix of the brands and the elements that are on the screen there. But Citrix and AWS, our networking stacks actually are pretty darn tightly integrated and work really, really well together. And they're an integral part of a migration effort. So whether that's leveraging any of the combination of connectivity methods that you get out of AWS, or also adding into that some of the fantastic capabilities we've got with the ADC or with SD-WAN, even to some of the next generation, kind of the cool new capabilities that we're bringing to the table. Do not forget about this stuff. You're going to end up seeing a lot more out of this on this topic from Citrix and Amazon as we move throughout this year. So we've got kind of a dedicated initiative digging into it. So now let's shift gears maybe and talk a little bit about some of the stuff that's coming soon. I think our first item on the list may have actually been mentioned in the keynote earlier. Yeah, it actually was up on the slides there. So AWS Outpost. This is something that was released at least as an announcement
from AWS, and coming out in the second half of 2019 is when it's scheduled. But AWS Outpost is AWS selling hardware into your data centers and to your facilities. So what that looks like from an AWS perspective, it's an extension to an AWS region. It's seen as another availability zone. This is something that is probably pretty important to a lot of people in the crowd. It's great for use cases where latency is a concern, or maybe you have applications that work with maybe manufacturing floors. Look to the news for more information about this, but this was announced at least back at our main event, reInvent. So that's an important piece to talk about. We can go into tons of details. We'll be after the session to chat about it if you want. Another thing is the graphics instances from AWS. So we've had a long history with graphics instances, EC2 instances in this space. The G2, G3, now G4 is announced in the works, and it's a private preview. But we also have a large list of other GPUs available within AWS. These are the ones that we see as being designed for desktop app workloads. To that extent, like the G3 instance type actually comes with the NVIDIA vApp, vWorkstation licenses.
That's the key right there, right?
Yeah.
And the difference between a compute workload on a GPU and a graphics workload on a GPU. So that's where you go to look for graphics accelerated instances.
Yep. Yeah. So look to those instance types. We have the G4 T4 instance type coming out. Look again to the news for more information about this.
All right, so stepping up our pace here a little bit. Some of the other enhancements that we brought up here, and I'm not going to dive into this first group in super deep level of detail, but I just want to point out some of the stuff that we're doing on the networking side. So you'll see some pretty extensive integration underneath those features and capabilities, like the ability for us to do HA in a variety of different scenarios. And the way we're doing it is pretty cool by leveraging some of the native Amazon services underneath to pull it off and provide a real high level of service. That also comes to things like autoscaling. Imagine having your NetScaler instances be able to scale up and scale down right alongside your application workload as demand goes up and goes down. Support for things like Elastic Network Adapter, custom CloudWatch metrics. It's not easy for me to say, evidently. Then we've also got some cool things that we've done here recently for MCS.
Yep. So being able to, in the past, have support for MCS with dedicated instances. We now have support for dedicated hosts. That helps you comply with, say, third-party licensing requirements. Also, identity access management, role-based access. Can go into tons of details here, but it's essentially us being able to rotate the secret and access keys for you to get into MCS on AWS. And then another one that's pretty cool is replace disk workflow. So we'll go a little bit more into detail on the next slide.
We will hit some of that. I'm going to drop one little line that we're not going to touch on too much here. But there's been a little bit of FUD in the marketplace here recently that may have people thinking that desktop workloads can't run on AWS.
Right. So desktop
Don't believe
workloads,
the FUD.
Yeah. Desktop workloads
possible.
do run on AWS. There are licensing considerations around that. From a Microsoft desktop operating system perspective, you do need to look at your license agreement with Microsoft with these things. But from what we've seen with customers, the dedicated instances or dedicated hosts comply with that, and it, from that perspective, is supported.
Cool. So why don't you give us the quick run through of this whole replace instance? This is kind of an impactful one for folks.
Yeah, so essentially looking at this diagram, there's a star next to the MCS catalog instance and the root EBS volume. In the past, those things were removed. They were terminated and they were thrown away for non-persistent desktop workloads on AWS. So with that, we kind of noticed that MCS, wasn't doing, the process around that wasn't maybe the most optimized. So what we found is if you actually just leave the EC2 instance there in a stop state, the cost association from that, there's nothing really, from a cost perspective that's an issue there. So the MCS change here is really to leave the MCS catalog EC2 instance there. The rest of the components are also staying there, like in the past, ENI, the volume identity, all those kind of components. But essentially, this kind of optimizes that. Given time, we can definitely go into this further if you want after the session, but tagging is another piece to that. Definitely another enhancement for MCS on AWS and making that process work better for customers.
Good stuff. All right, so we're getting close. We I think, officially got our warning that the news was about to, to stretch around our necks. So let me just do a real quick recap. For starters, I hope what you've gathered from this, by looking at and recognizing how long these two organizations have been working together, both being leaders in the field, the first public cloud that you could run Citrix virtual apps and desktops on being AWS, that this type of workload is actually a great fit. It's a natural fit.
Yep.
We also talked a little bit about the multiple deployment options that are available. And the main direction I'll kind of take you to there, being a very forward-thinking type of a person, I would definitely strongly consider the Citrix Cloud delivered services. They provide a ton of value, and I'd also recommend that you consider a move and improve type of a strategy for the workload versus just taking what you've got and moving it up. Because the hard part in most of this stuff tends to be what goes into your image, right? The stack inside of your VDA. So that stack you can bring up pretty much straight and easy. Moving the brokering is actually pretty straightforward. If you are migrating to AWS, again, don't forget about your network. I mean, it seems like a smack in the forehead, duh, kind of a comment, but it's pretty amazing how many customers we see actually bump into that. And finally, I'll point out, leverage some of the tools that we've created. So I mentioned that we got the quick start templates out there. Great way to learn this stuff. We've got this lab now that we can replicate and bring and recreate the experience for you and your audience. And also the AWS Accelerate program. And for some of those pieces that do require a little bit of outreach, you can hit us up at aws@citrix.com or citrix@amazon.com if you got any more information or you'd like to pursue some of these programs. So last couple of closing points, since these are going to be recorded, even though some of this stuff is actually will be in the past here shortly, you've got an opportunity to go back. So any of the stuff that you saw, you'll actually be able to go and grab this deck. So you don't need to worry about capturing pictures or screenshots, unless you want. We can give you the star pose or something like that. So you'll actually be able to go back and review this stuff after the fact. Then one point, and this I'm gonna make this ask on my behalf and on Andrew's, because we're very, very serious about being here, and our goal is to provide the best possible session, give you the things that you're looking for. If you got any kind of feedback, positive or negative, please, please, please throw it into the session survey. It does us a massive favor. We learn a lot from that. And that also gets you some points in the crazy game on game. So, if you're playing that, you could score some pretty good prizes. So with that, on behalf of Citrix and AWS and our alliance, I want to thank you all for spending the time with us this morning. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.